So we're going to talk about conditional statements. And before we talk about conditional statements, let's talk about the vocabulary and the definitions. A conditional statement is an if-then statement. Conditional statements are an if-then statement. All right, so with conditional statements, we have two parts. We have the if and then the then. The if part we call the hypothesis. All right, so that hypothesis is the part P following the if. So it's the first part. It's the beginning part of a conditional statement. And then the second part, the then, we call the conclusion. So the conclusion is the part Q following the then. So if P, then Q. So if we're looking at the symbols here and the notation for conditional statements, the beginning part, the hypothesis, is my P, the beginning. So if P, then Q. And the Q would be my conclusion. So the hypothesis, P, then the conclusion, Q. So if P, then Q. So if we look at the diagram for conditional statements, all right, we can see that we have two circles, one within another. All right, the hypothesis, the if P part, is always going to be inside the conclusion. So right here in this circle right here, we're going to have our hypothesis, or my if P. All right, and then with the diagram, we can conclude that if P, then the hypothesis would be within the conclusion, Q. Nice example here, example 1 of a conditional statement. The directions say, underline the hypothesis and circle the conclusion. So again, the if this, so just as you guessed, the first part here, if an animal is a robin, all right, there's my hypothesis, then the animal is a bird. Well, the second part, the then Q part, is my conclusion. So I'm going to go ahead and circle that. So again, the hypothesis, if the animal is a robin, so there's my if P, and then here's my then the animal is a bird. There's my Q. So my P, and then my Q. And then we have the diagram. We can go ahead and put this in there. So again, my hypothesis has to be within my conclusion. So we're looking at if an animal is a robin. So my robin goes in the little circle within the conclusion. So there's my hypothesis, P. Then the animal is a bird. Well, I have different types of this holds true that the robin would be within any kind of bird. Now, sometime now we're given conditional statements that aren't written in the if-then form. So we have statements and we can go ahead and try to put them in the if-then form to make it a conditional statement. So with this next example 2, we're going to go ahead and try to write that following statement as a conditional. So we got two things we can look at. First, we're going to want to identify the hypothesis and the conclusion. All right? And then second, we'll go ahead and write the conditional. So right here's our statement. Vertical angles share a vertex. All right? So we're going to go ahead and use the same technique as we did before. And we're going to go ahead and say that the hypothesis is that we have vertical angles. All right? And then my conclusion is, if we have vertical angles, then my conclusion is then they share a vertex. So let's go ahead and draw a diagram to remind us what vertical angles are. So if I have vertical angles, then share a vertex right here. All right? So I identified my hypothesis, P, the vertical angles, if we have vertical angles, and then identified my conclusion, then they'll share a vertex. All right? So then my second thing says, go ahead and write your conditional. So we're going to go ahead and do that. If, and we can say this in different ways. We can say if the angles are vertical, then they share a vertex. All right. So if the angles are vertical, there's my hypothesis. Then they share a vertex. And there's my conclusion. So with our diagram this time, let's go ahead and talk about the conclusion first. All right? So we can talk about all angles that share a vertex. All right? So adjacent angles share a vertex. Linear pairs share a vertex, and so on. All right? But with our hypothesis, all right, these vertical angles are a given type that share a vertex. So in this category right here only talks about vertical angles. But for the bigger circle, though, it could include adjacent, linear pair, and whatnot. But for this situation, this statement, only if it's a vertical angles, then they share a vertex.